Hello, hello. Today we're going to talk about Etsy group. So before I get into this, let's talk about what are groups in Linux. So let's think about this. Let's say you're a company and you have a bunch of different job roles and you have a lot of users constantly coming in and coming out because you have a lot of employees that you go through. So considering this scenario, imagine that when configuring our system, every time someone changes jobs, or like they got promoted, or maybe they got fired, we would have to configure that user individually for all the different things on the system. And when we have a small number of users, that's okay. But when we have a lot of users and it's happening frequently, it can get pretty painful. So the idea is let's create groups. And so these groups are going to have the defined roles and responsibilities. For example, we could have an administrator group, which can do all of the sysadmin stuff on the system. And then the idea is that whenever we want a user to become a sysadmin, we can just add them to that administrator group and they'll automatically get all the privileges associated with that. Specifically, in Linux world, the group that we use for that is called sudo. And so sudo allows us to do sysadmin stuff, basically gives us effectively root control over the system. So sudo is a pretty important group. Now, with that being said, Etsy group, I like to think of it as, you know how Etsy password contained all the config information for users? Etsy group has all of the config information for groups. And so you'll see it has the same permissions of 644. So root can read and write, but anyone can read. And again, if you want to learn this in more detail, this is a great blog post explaining how it works. But for now, I'm just going to cover this. So if we were to, let's say, look at Etsy group, we would see that it's like Etsy password. We have a line for each group, okay? So each group gets its own line, and we'll see that we have 4 fields associated with it. The first is the name of the group. Then we have the password. Similar for Etsy password, it's going to be an X because it should not be stored here. It's actually stored in a different file called gshadow, which I'll cover in the next video. But there's a password, and there's also a group ID. It's just the ID associated with the group. There's nothing really special going on like we had for root before. It's just the group ID, okay? And then lastly, we have the users. These are the users that belong to that group and have those group privileges. So with that being said, what can we actually backdoor? What can Red Team do to exploit this? Not much, but there is one important thing, which is the groups themselves, right? Certain groups have administrator access over the system. So if I was able to get my malicious user to be a part of that group, now I can escalate to root. And so there's a few different ways we can do this. There's certain groups that are important to look out for. Number one is sudo. Sudo is basically, if you can sudo, you can do things as root. You only want privileged users to have sudo. Lots of times backdoors are going to be people being able to sudo when they shouldn't be able to. So that is probably the most important group. If you are using a Red Hat based system, you won't see the word sudo, instead you'll see wheel. So it's basically the same thing as sudo, just goes by a different name. Additionally, this rarely shows up, but sometimes you have an admin user, which is basically the same thing as sudo, but it is pretty rare. So that is sudo, by far the easiest group to exploit. It's just, are you a part of it? If so, now you can do crazy things. And here I list some other ones that are able to be exploited. ADM user, what this is basically a log admin. This user can view all the logs. And while this in itself won't allow you to escalate to root, it does make your life easier because you can see all the logs, so you can see any sort of authentication attempts or any time a service fails to authenticate, you can see what's going on. And so this, I include a link to an article that basically walks through how you can utilize this to escalate to root. But it on its own is not going to help you become root. What it does is it makes it easier to point out the vulnerabilities in the system. So that's ADM. And then these two are pretty similar. Docker and LXD, which is the Linux container daemon, I think. What either of these would do is these can control containers on your system. And what the container is, it's basically a contained mini version of an operating system. Is a simple way of thinking about it. They're meant to run specific services or processes in a very predictable way. So how this can be exploited is if you're part of the Docker container, you have root access over containers, okay? So for those mini versions of the operating system, you can control them as if you were root, but not for the system itself, okay? However, there is a exploit method where you can basically escape from a Docker container to access the file system as a whole. And here is a video that walks through how you can do that. It is a convoluted process, so definitely go ahead and watch the original video, figure it out. Same thing for LXD, it's even more convoluted, but same idea. We make a container that is malicious and use it to mount the file system of the machine. So therefore, it basically gives us root access over the machine's file system. And besides this, there are other users that could maybe be used. I've heard dial out or device. Those users could escalate to root, but it's only in very specific misconfiguration scenarios where being part of the group alone doesn't allow you to escalate privileges. It's being part of that group plus some very specific condition allows you to escalate. So for those, I'm just going to ignore them for now. Maybe we add it later as a future vulnerability. But those are the groups to look out for. So how can I make... Oh, right. So those are the groups to look out for. How you can become a part of them is just add your name to the users at the end there. And then now that user is part of the group and they can do shenanigans. So how do we defend this as blue team? You just look at Etsy group and make sure you don't have any weird stuff like that going on. If you see something that's unusual, remove it, okay? These users should be fairly restricted. So that's pretty simple. And there's one other thing we can do, which is permissions. Once again, we have specific permissions. This is like Etsy password. So if we modify it to be 666, then anyone can modify this file. Therefore, anyone can add their user to the sudo group and do shenanigans there. So to secure that, once again, it's just change it back. So let's go ahead and let's test this. I'm going to do, there's a lot of examples, so like sudo group, ADM user, Docker user, LXD, all of these test what we just talked about along with perm group. So I'm just going to do sudo group and perm group as an example, and feel free to do the rest on your own. So just logging in. Okay. Let's go back to BlueDaBaDee. We're here. So I'm going to pick my modules. I wanted sudo group and perm group. Okay, and if I check my selection, yep, that's what I wanted. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up. Boom. Okay. And let's run the checker. Let's see, we have 2 vulnerabilities. Okay. So that's that. let's go ahead and first what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to users and I'm going to list user colors. So as we discussed previously, you want to make sure that these files have what you need. So just check in admin users. Yep, that has our admin users. And then regular users. Yep, those are the regular users on the system. So with that knowledge, I can then list all my colors. And it's going to go through all of the different users and point out anything weird. And so what we want to see is for this G over here, this G points out anyone in one of these sus groups. And so we can look for anyone who has it. So cis is expected. I think specifically they're part of ADM, so they can write to logs. LP, I'm not sure, but it is a service user. Maybe we want to investigate that later. Syslog, obviously we need ADM for login. Anything else? Oh, we have a few. Okay, that's me. I want to be sudo, yes. That's Jotaro. He is our admin user, as we can see here. Right, he's blue, which means he should have admin access. However, Jolene is green. She should be a regular user, not someone who can escalate using sudo. So that's a no-no. Let's go ahead and look at Etsy group. And if we look for Jolene, we see she's part of sudo. That's not good. So let's remove that, okay? And we're done. Let's go ahead and go back to BlueDaBaDee and let's check. Hey, we got it. Okay, but there's still one more vulnerability. So let's go ahead and check the permissions of Etsy group. Okay, so just a simple ls, and we see 666. Not good. So let's go ahead and change that to 644. And doing that, let's check it again. Yep, looks like 644. Let's check. Hey, and we solved it. So that is all the vulnerabilities for Etsy group. Again, you could test it out for the other users, the other groups like Docker and LXD. Have fun with that. I included the tutorials to help with that. But with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.